Welcome, my friend. You've found a quiet place to rest your thoughts. Tonight, I'll guide you through a story gentle and slow about one of the most influential figures in psychology, William James, a physician, philosopher, and pioneer of the mind who stood at the crossroads of science and spirit, who explored the mind, discovering the flowing stream of consciousness, the textures of religious experience, and the pragmatic truths that guide us through ambiguity and wonder. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the intangibility of spirit, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of William James as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. We begin in the winter of 1842, in the Astor House Hotel in New York City, where a child was born into a family that would leave an indelible mark on American intellectual life. William James entered the world on January 11th, the first child of Henry James, Sr., and Mary Robertson, Walsh James. His father was a man of independent means, an inheritor of wealth, who devoted his life not to commerce, but to the restless pursuit of theological and philosophical truth. Henry James Sr. was a disciple of the Swedish mystic, Emanuel Swedenborg, and his home would become a crossroads for the great minds of the 19th century, a salon where Ralph Waldo Emerson might discuss transcendentalism over dinner, where Margaret Fuller might debate the rights of women, where Henry David Thoreau might speak of his experiment at Walden Pond. Into this atmosphere of intellectual ferment, William James was born. His childhood was nomadic, unusual, deliberately unstructured. His father believed that conventional education stifled the soul, that the spirit required freedom to flourish in its own organic way. And so the James family traveled constantly from New York to Europe and back again, from Paris to London to Geneva, sampling schools and tutors and cultural experiences with a kind of restless hunger for variety. William attended no fewer than a dozen different schools before his adolescence ended. He studied in Manhattan one year, in Paris the next. He learned French from native speakers, absorbed art in the galleries of the Louvre, walked the streets of London, and returned to American soil only to depart again. This peripatetic childhood shaped William in profound ways. He developed a cosmopolitan sensibility, a facility with languages, an eye for art and beauty, and a restless temperament that would never quite settle into the conventional rhythms of academic life. But it also left him unmoored, uncertain of his place in the world, struggling with a question that would haunt him for decades. What should I do with my life? His younger brother, Henry, born in 1843, just 15 months after William would find his calling early. Henry James would become one of the great novelists of the English language, a craftsman of psychological fiction who explored the inner lives of his characters with unprecedented subtlety. But William's path was more tortuous, more uncertain. As a young man, he showed talent in multiple directions. He could draw and paint with genuine skill. His father encouraged this artistic bent, and for a time, William considered becoming a painter. But there was something in him that demanded not just representation, but understanding. He wanted not merely to capture the surface of things, but to penetrate their depths. In his late teens, William persuaded his father to let him study with William Morris Hunt, a distinguished painter who maintained a studio in Newport, Rhode Island. For months, William devoted himself to the discipline of art. He learned to see light and shadow, to understand composition, to translate the three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional canvas. But even as he developed technical proficiency, he felt a growing unease. Art, he began to realize, was not his true vocation. It was too solitary, too removed from the questions that burned within him. He wanted to understand not just what things looked like, but how they worked, how consciousness itself operated, how the human mind constructed its experience of reality. And so, in 1861, at the age of 19, William James enrolled at the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard University to study chemistry. It was the beginning of a long, irregular, and often agonizing journey through higher education. The Civil War was beginning that year, and William's younger brothers Garth Wilkinson and Robertson would both serve in the Union Army. Wilkie, with particular distinction in the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first African-American units. But William did not enlist. He suffered from various physical ailments, back problems, digestive issues, and what physicians of the time called weakness of the nerves. Whether these conditions were primarily physical or psychological remains a matter of debate, but they exempted him from military service and marked the beginning of a long period of ill health that would shadow his early adult years. His studies at Harvard were interrupted and circuitous. He switched from chemistry to comparative anatomy and physiology, drawn increasingly toward the study of living systems. In 1864, he entered Harvard Medical School, pursuing a degree that would give him a scientific foundation for understanding the human organism. But even here, his education was marked by interruptions. In 1865, he joined the naturalist Louis Agassiz on a specimen collecting expedition to Brazil. It was a journey into the Amazon, a confrontation with the overwhelming fecundity of nature, the sheer profusion of life forms that seemed to resist classification and comprehension. On that journey through the Brazilian rainforest, William James encountered something that would stay with him forever. The sense of nature's abundance, its refusal to conform to neat categories, its pluralistic and endlessly generative character. He also encounters something darker, his own profound depression. Far from home, surrounded by the oppressive heat and the screaming vitality of the jungle, William fell into a despair so deep that he contemplated suicide. He wrote in his journals of feeling useless, of questioning the meaning of his existence, of confronting the abyss of his own purposelessness. This darkness would recur throughout his 20s. After returning from Brazil in 1866, he resumed his medical studies, but his health deteriorated further. He suffered from back pain so severe that he could barely sit upright. His eyes troubled him, making reading difficult. His digestion was unreliable. And beneath these physical complaints lay a profound psychological crisis, a crisis of meaning, purpose, and will. In 1867, seeking relief from his ailments and his melancholy, William traveled to Germany to take the waters at various spas and to attend lectures on physiology and psychology. He spent more than a year in Europe, moving between Dresden, Berlin, and various health resorts, subjecting himself to cold baths and mineral treatments, reading voraciously in German philosophy and nascent experimental psychology, and wrestling with the demons of his own mind. It was during this period that William James encountered the philosophy that would contribute to his eventual recovery and would fundamentally shape his thinking. He read the work of the French philosopher Charles Renouvier, particularly his essays on free will. Renouvier argued that free will was not something that could be proven scientifically, but was rather a postulate that one could choose to believe, and that this choice itself was an act of freedom. For William, suffering under the weight of deterministic philosophies that seemed to reduce human beings to mere mechanisms, this idea came as a revelation. In April of 1870, at the age of 28, William James wrote in his diary an entry that marked a turning point in his life. He declared that his first act of free will would be to believe in free will itself. He would assume that he had the power to direct his attention, to choose his thoughts, to shape his character through deliberate effort. This was not a conclusion derived from empirical evidence, but an existential commitment, a leap of faith that preceded proof. It was, in essence, an early formulation of the idea that would later become his doctrine of the will to believe. Following this resolution, William James slowly began to recover. He completed his medical degree in 1869, though he never practiced medicine as a physician. Instead, he began to find his vocation in teaching and writing. In 1872, Harvard offered him an appointment as an instructor of physiology. It was a modest position, but it provided him with an institutional anchor. He taught courses on anatomy and physiology, but increasingly his interests turned toward the emerging field of psychology. At this time, psychology was not yet an independent discipline. It existed in the borderlands between philosophy and physiology, between armchair speculation about the soul and laboratory investigation of sensory processes. In Germany, researchers like Gustav Fechner and Wilhelm Wundt were attempting to establish psychology as a rigorous experimental science, measuring reaction times and sensory thresholds, seeking the mathematical laws that govern mental phenomena. In Britain, associationist philosophers like Alexander Bain and Herbert Spencer were attempting to explain consciousness as a complex assemblage of sensations bound together by the laws of association. William James was fascinated by these developments, but from the beginning, he was skeptical of any approach that seemed to reduce the richness of conscious experience to mechanical formulas. His medical training had taught him to respect the complexity of living systems. His philosophical reading had convinced him that rationalist systems often distorted reality to fit their neat categories, and his own introspective experience, the years of depression, the struggle with meaning, the deliberate cultivation of will had taught him that consciousness was something more fluid, more purposive, more personal than the atomistic models suggested. In 1875, James established what is often considered the first psychology laboratory in America, a small demonstration room where students could perform simple experiments on sensation and perception. It was not as systematically organized as Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig, which is usually credited as the first true psychology laboratory, established in 1879. But James's effort represented an American approach to the subject, pragmatic, exploratory, less concerned with establishing psychology as a rigorous science than with using scientific methods to illuminate the problems of consciousness. In 1878, two important things happened in William James's life. First, he married Alice Howe Gibbons, a woman of intelligence and stability who would provide him with the domestic foundation he had always lacked. Their marriage was, by the standards of Victorian propriety and by the testimony of their letters, a source of genuine happiness and support. Alice understood William's intellectual passions, tolerated his periods of doubt and illness, and managed the practical affairs of their household, allowing him the freedom to think and write. Second, he signed a contract with the publisher Henry Holt to write a textbook on psychology. The contract specified that the book should be delivered in 2 years. It would actually take 12 years to complete, and the book that emerged, The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, would be not a mere textbook, but a masterwork, one of the most influential and beautifully written books in the history of psychology. But let us not rush ahead. The 1800s were years of intense intellectual labor for William James. He was promoted through the ranks at Harvard, moving from instructor to assistant professor to full professor, and his teaching duties expanded to include courses not just in physiology, but in psychology and philosophy. He was a beloved teacher, known for his informal style, his use of vivid examples and metaphors, his willingness to entertain questions and objections, and his refusal to present his views as dogma. Students would later recall the sense of excitement in his classroom, the feeling that ideas were alive and mattered, that the questions they were exploring had genuine stakes for human life. During these years, James was writing constantly, not just the slowly evolving manuscript of the Principles, but also essays and reviews for philosophical and scientific journals. He was reading everything he could find on psychology, philosophy, and related fields. He corresponded with scholars around the world, engaging with the latest developments in experimental psychology in Germany, with the theories of evolution being debated in Britain, with the philosophies of pragmatism being developed by his friend Charles Sanders Peirce. His family life expanded. He and Alice had 5 children. Henry, born in 1879. William, born in 1880. 2. Herman, born in 1884, but who died in infancy. Margaret Mary, born in 1887. And Alexander, born in 1890. The James household was lively, affectionate, and intellectually stimulating. William was a devoted father, albeit one whose attention was often divided between his children and his work. He would take his children on walks in the woods around their summer home in Chocorua, New Hampshire, teaching them to observe nature, to ask questions, to think for themselves. His brother Henry, meanwhile, was establishing himself as a major literary figure. Henry lived mostly in Europe, eventually settling in England, but the brothers maintained a rich correspondence throughout their lives. Their letters reveal both deep affection and a certain sibling rivalry, a mutual respect mixed with gentle teasing about their respective vocations. Henry would write novels that explored consciousness through the techniques of narrative fiction, using stream of consciousness narration and subtle psychological observation. William would explore consciousness through philosophy and psychology, using introspection and scientific investigation. In many ways, they were engaged in parallel projects, using different methods to map the same mysterious territory of human experience. In 1890, The Principles of Psychology was finally published 2 massive volumes totaling nearly 1,400 pages. It was not the concise textbook the publisher had hoped for, but an encyclopedic treatment of the entire field of psychology as it then existed, combined with original insights that would reshape the discipline. The book was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. It became the standard text for psychology courses across America and was widely read in Europe as well. It established James not just as a professor, but as the most important psychologist in America, the founder of a distinctively American approach to the science of the mind. What made the principles so remarkable was not just the comprehensiveness of its coverage, but the quality of James's writing and thinking. He discussed all the standard topics: sensation, perception, attention, memory, reasoning, emotion, will, but he approached each with a combination of scientific rigor and philosophical depth. He drew on the latest experimental findings from the laboratories of Europe, but subjected them to critical scrutiny, always asking whether the methods used were adequate to the phenomena being studied. He incorporated insights from evolutionary biology, arguing that mental processes must be understood in terms of their adaptive functions. He used introspection as a method, but warned against its pitfalls. And he wrote with a clarity and vividness that made even technical discussions readable. But perhaps the most important contribution of the principles was its central metaphor, the image that would become James's most enduring legacy to psychology, the stream of consciousness. Before James, the dominant model of consciousness in psychology was atomistic. Influenced by British empiricism and by the success of chemistry in analyzing complex substances into simple elements, psychologists tended to think of consciousness as composed of discrete sensations that were somehow combined or associated into more complex experiences. Consciousness, in this view, was like a mosaic made up of many small pieces fitted together. James argued that this model fundamentally misrepresented the nature of conscious experience. When we actually pay attention to our own consciousness, he insisted, we do not find discrete sensations. We find something continuous, something that flows. Consciousness is not like a chain of separate beads, but like a river, constantly moving, constantly changing, yet retaining a sense of continuity and connectedness. He wrote, in one of the most famous passages in the Principles, consciousness, then, does not appear to itself chopped up in bits. Such words as chain or train do not describe it fitly as it presents itself in the first instance. It is nothing jointed. It flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought, of consciousness, or of subjective life. This stream of consciousness is characterized by several essential features, James argued. First, it is continuous. There are no gaps or breaks in our experience of consciousness, even though its content is constantly changing. Second, it is selective consciousness, is always choosing, always focusing on some aspects of experience while ignoring others. Third, it is personal. My consciousness is mine, irreducibly subjective, distinct from yours. Fourth, it is always changing. We can never have exactly the same thought twice. The stream never reverses or repeats itself exactly. And fifth, it is intentional. It is always about something, always directed toward objects beyond itself. These characteristics might seem obvious to us now, but they represented a profound shift in how psychologists thought about the mind. James was arguing that consciousness is not a passive receptor of sensations, but an active, selective, purposive process. It is not a thing, but an activity, a stream of experiencing that selects, interprets, and shapes the world according to interests and purposes. This way of thinking about consciousness had important implications. It meant that psychology could not be reduced to the physics of sensations, The relations between sensations, the sense of continuity, the feelings of transition, the experience of meaning are just as much a part of experience as the sensations themselves. James called this view radical empiricism, and it would become one of the defining features of his philosophy. Radical empiricism insisted that if we are going to be truly empirical, truly faithful to experience as it is actually lived, we must acknowledge that experience includes relations, feelings, meanings, and the sense of flow. We must not limit our empiricism to what can be measured in a laboratory, while ignoring the richer texture of lived experience. The principles also contained James's influential theory of emotion, developed in conjunction with a Danish physiologist, Carl Lang, and thus known as the James-Lang theory. The common-sense view of emotion, James noted, is that we perceive something, experience an emotion, and then undergo bodily changes. For example, we see a bear, we feel afraid, and then our heart races and we run. James argued that the sequence is actually reversed. We see the bear, our body reacts, and our feeling of the bodily changes is the emotion. We do not run because we are afraid because we run. Or as James put it, with characteristic vividness, we are afraid because we tremble, not we tremble because we are afraid. This counterintuitive theory was controversial, and it sparked decades of debate, but its deeper significance lay in what it suggested about the relationship between mind and body. James was arguing that mental life is not separate from bodily life, but intimately connected with it. Our emotions are grounded in our visceral experiences, in the feedback from our autonomic nervous system. To understand the mind, we must understand the body. The principles also explored the nature of the self. James distinguished between the I and the me, between the self as knower and the self as known. The me is the empirical self, the self as object, which includes our material possessions, our social relationships, our psychological traits. The I is the self as subject, the pure ego, the sense of personal agency that seems to persist through all our changing experiences. This distinction anticipated many later developments in phenomenology and existentialism, and it reflected James's nuanced understanding that the self is not a simple entity, but a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. After the publication of the Principles, James's reputation was secure. He was recognized as the preeminent psychologist in America, and he received invitations to lecture across the United States and in Europe. But interestingly, having established psychology as a scientific discipline, James began to turn away from it. He found the laboratory work tedious. He was increasingly critical of the narrowness of experimental psychology, which he felt was obsessed with minutiae while ignoring the larger questions of human existence. He began to describe himself as a philosopher rather than a psychologist, and his subsequent work would focus on philosophical questions. In 1896, he delivered a lecture to the philosophical clubs of Yale and Brown universities that would become one of his most famous and controversial essays, The Will to Believe. In this lecture, James defended the rationality of faith. He argued that there are situations in life where we must make decisions without sufficient evidence, where the decision itself cannot wait for proof. In such situations, when the choice is between what he called live options, genuine possibilities that speak to our nature, we have the right to let our passional nature decide, to make a leap of faith. This was not an argument for believing just anything. James insisted that the will to believe applied only to forced options, where not choosing is itself a choice, living options between genuine possibilities that appeal to us, and momentous options, where the stakes are significant. In such cases, when intellectual evidence is genuinely insufficient, we have the right to believe according to our hopes and needs. Indeed, in some cases, James argued, belief can create its own verification. If I believe that a friendship is possible, I will act in ways that make it possible. If I refuse to believe until the friendship is proven, I may never take the actions that would bring it about. This pragmatic approach to belief was characteristic of James's broader philosophical stance. He was part of a movement known as pragmatism, which had been pioneered by his friend Charles Sanders Peirce. Pragmatism, as James developed it, was not a theory of truth as mere utility, as it is sometimes caricatured. Rather, it was a method for clarifying ideas by examining their practical consequences. To understand what a concept means, pragmatism asks, what difference would it make to our experience if this idea were true rather than false? Ideas that make no practical difference are meaningless. Truth, for pragmatists, is not a static correspondence between ideas and reality, but a dynamic process. An idea is true to the extent that it works, to the extent that it proves useful in guiding our actions and predictions. This might sound relativistic or subjectivist, but James insisted that pragmatism did not mean anything goes. True ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true through a process of verification in experience. And different truths may be appropriate for different purposes and contexts. James applied this pragmatic method to some of the most contentious philosophical questions. He was critical of rationalist metaphysics that claimed to deduce the nature of ultimate reality from pure logic. He was equally critical of crude materialism that reduced all of existence to matter in motion. Instead, he advocated for what he called a pluralistic universe, a world of genuine diversity and contingency, a world not fully determined by mechanical laws, a world where novelty and creativity are real. In his 1906 to 1907 Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh, published as A Pluralistic Universe, James argued against the dominant philosophical systems of his time, particularly the absolute idealism associated with thinkers like Josiah Royce and the British Hegelians. These philosophers conceived of reality as a single, unified whole, an absolute mind or spirit, in which all apparent contradictions and divisions are reconciled. James found this vision monstrously abstract and deeply untrue to lived experience. Reality, as we actually encounter it, is messy, plural, unfinished. The world is not a closed system, but an open one, not a cosmos, but a multiverse. James's vision of a pluralistic universe had both metaphysical and moral dimensions. Metaphysically, it meant that reality is not fully determined, that genuine novelty is possible, that the future is not simply the unfolding of a predetermined plan. Morally, it meant that our choices matter, that the universe is genuinely at risk, that what we do makes a real difference to the course of events. If the universe were a closed system, if everything were already determined, then human effort would be pointless. But if reality is open and plural, then we are genuine participants in the creation of the future. This leads us to one of the most distinctive and enduring aspects of William James's work, his exploration of religious experience. In 1901 to 1902, James delivered another series of Gifford lectures at Edinburgh, which were published in 1902 as The Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature. This book would become one of the classics of both psychology and religious studies, a work that approached religion not through theology or philosophy, but through the empirical study of personal religious experiences. James's method in the Varieties was to collect accounts of religious experiences from a wide range of sources: autobiographies, journals, testimonies, and mystical texts from various traditions. He was interested not in religious institutions or doctrines, but in what he called personal religion, the direct experiences of individuals who felt themselves in contact with the divine or the transcendent. He wanted to understand the psychological dimensions of these experiences. What did they feel like? What effects did they have on people's lives? What common patterns could be discerned across different individuals and traditions? James organized his investigation around several key types of religious experience and religious personality. He distinguished between the religion of healthy-mindedness and the sick soul. Healthy-minded religion is optimistic, focusing on the goodness of existence, the presence of divine grace, the possibility of happiness and wholeness. It is the religion of Walt Whitman, who celebrated the body and the world with exuberant affirmation. The sick soul, by contrast, is acutely aware of suffering, sin, and the tragic dimensions of existence. It sees the world as fundamentally problematic, requiring not mere affirmation but transformation or redemption. This was the religion of Leo Tolstoy, who experienced a profound existential crisis and could find meaning only through spiritual conversion. James acknowledged the appeal of healthy-mindedness, but confessed that he found the religion of the sick soul to be more profound. It seemed to him more adequate to the full range of human experience, more honest about the reality of suffering and death. Healthy-mindedness, he suggested, works well enough if one is fortunate, if life is kind. But for those who have suffered deeply, for those who have confronted the abyss, a more complex religious response is necessary. He devoted considerable attention to the phenomenon of conversion, the sudden or gradual transformation of personality in which someone moves from a state of dividedness and struggle to a state of unity and peace. James collected numerous accounts of conversion experiences, noting their common features: a sense of incompleteness or wrongness, a struggle that reaches a point of crisis, a sudden breakthrough or gradual shift, and then a sense of newness, of having been reborn, of perceiving the world in a transformed way. These conversions, James noted, often had lasting effects on character and conduct, suggesting that they were not merely subjective fantasies, but genuine psychological realities. He was particularly fascinated by mystical experiences, those intense, ineffable moments in which individuals report a direct apprehension of ultimate reality, a sense of unity with the divine or the cosmos, a knowing that transcends conceptual thought. James identified 4 common characteristics of mystical experiences. First, they are ineffable. They cannot be adequately described in words. They must be directly experienced. Second, they are noetic. They feel like states of knowledge, insights into depths of truth that rational thought cannot reach. Third, they are transient. They do not last long, typically only a few minutes or hours, though their effects may endure. And fourth, they are passive, the mystic feels, overtaken by a power beyond his or her own will. James took mystical experiences seriously as data for psychology and philosophy. He did not dismiss them as delusions or pathologies, though he acknowledged that they might sometimes be associated with abnormal mental states. Rather, he insisted that mystical states were valid forms of experience that deserved careful study. They suggested, at minimum, that ordinary waking consciousness is not the only kind of consciousness there is. As James memorably put it, our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness, as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. What should we make of these experiences philosophically? James argued that mystical experiences have authority for those who have them. They are self-authenticating in the moment, and they often have profound effects on belief and behavior. But they do not have authority for those who have not had them. This was consistent with James's pragmatic approach. The meaning and value of religious experiences must be judged by their fruits, by their effects on life. Do they make people more loving, more courageous, more generous? Do they enhance life or diminish it? James also explored the phenomenon of saintliness, the transformed life of the religious devotee, characterized by qualities like asceticism, strength of soul, purity, and charity. Saints, James observed, exhibit certain common traits across different religious traditions, a feeling that there is a higher power or order with which one can harmonize, a sense that this higher power is friendly, and that surrender to it is the path to salvation. A profound shift in emotional center from anxiety to happiness and peace, and an expansion of loving impulses toward others. James was respectful of saintly lives, but not uncritical. He acknowledged that religious devotion could sometimes lead to excess to pathological asceticism, to self-righteousness, to fanaticism. The question was always pragmatic. Does this form of religious life enhance human flourishing, or does it diminish it? Throughout the varieties, James maintained a delicate balance between sympathy and critical distance. He approached religious experiences with the respect of a phenomenologist, attempting to understand them from the inside, in their own terms. But he also evaluated them with the practical eye of a psychologist and pragmatist, asking about their causes and their consequences. He did not argue that religious experiences proved the existence of God or the truth of any particular theology. Instead, he argued that religious experiences were real psychological phenomena with real effects, and that they suggested dimensions of reality beyond the purely material. The varieties of religious experience had enormous influence, not just in psychology and philosophy, but in the broader culture. It legitimized the study of religious experience as a subject for academic inquiry. It provided a framework for understanding religious conversion, mysticism, and spirituality that was both scientific and sympathetic. And it articulated a vision of religion as fundamentally about personal experience rather than institutional authority or doctrinal correctness. A vision that resonated with many readers in the 20th century and continues to resonate today. In the years following the publication of the Varieties, James continued to write and lecture on philosophical topics. He became an increasingly public intellectual, weighing in on political and social issues. He was a vocal opponent of American imperialism, particularly the U.S., annexation of the Philippines, following the Spanish-American War. He saw this as a betrayal of American democratic ideals and spoke out passionately against it, joining the Anti-Imperialist League and writing letters and essays condemning the use of military force to subjugate other peoples. He also became interested in psychical research, the investigation of allegedly paranormal phenomena such as telepathy, mediumship, and survival after death. This was a controversial interest, and many of his scientific colleagues were skeptical or dismissive. But James approached psychical research with the same open-minded empiricism he brought to other subjects. He was not credulous. He was well aware of the possibilities for fraud and self-deception. But he also felt that anomalous experiences deserved investigation rather than dismissal. He served as president of the Society for Psychical Research and investigated several prominent mediums, including Leonora Piper, whose apparent abilities he found difficult to explain away entirely. His interest in psychical research was consistent with his broader philosophical commitments. If consciousness is not reducible to brain states, if reality is more than just matter in motion, then perhaps consciousness has dimensions or capacities that current science does not recognize. James did not claim to have proven survival after death or the reality of telepathy, but he remained open to these possibilities and critical of those who dismissed them out of hand without proper investigation. By the early 1900s, James's health, never robust, began to deteriorate more seriously. He suffered from heart disease, and physical exertion became increasingly difficult. He took a leave of absence from Harvard in 1899 and formally retired in 1907, though he continued to write and lecture. His last major work, Some Problems of Philosophy, was left incomplete at his death and published posthumously in 1911. In the summer of 1910, while staying at his country home in Chocorua, New Hampshire, James's heart condition worsened dramatically. His family brought him back to their home in Cambridge, but it was clear that the end was near. He died on August 26, 1910, at the age of 68, surrounded by his family. His wife Alice and his brother Henry were both present. The obituaries and tributes that followed his death testified to the enormous impact he had made, not just on psychology and philosophy, but on American intellectual life more broadly. He was remembered as a brilliant thinker, a gifted writer, a beloved teacher, and a man of rare moral seriousness and personal warmth. His students spoke of his generosity, his willingness to take ideas seriously no matter who proposed them, his refusal to stand on academic dignity. And yet, for all his accomplishments, William James remained in some ways a deeply uncertain man, never entirely free of the doubts that had plagued him in his youth. His letters and private writings reveal someone who struggled continually with questions of meaning, with the justification of his choices, with the problem of reconciling his philosophical commitments with his emotional needs. This very uncertainty, this refusal to settle into easy answers, was part of what made him such a profound and honest thinker. He knew from the inside what it was to confront doubt, meaninglessness, and despair, and his philosophy was in large part an attempt to find a way to live courageously in the face of these challenges. Now, having traced the arc of his life from his peripatetic childhood, through his years of illness and uncertainty, through his slow discovery of his vocation, through his establishment of American psychology, and his explorations of religious experience, let us turn more deeply into the ideas themselves, into the stream of consciousness and the varieties of religious experience, into the radical empiricism and the pluralistic universe, into the will to believe and the pragmatic method. Let us begin with the stream of consciousness, for this is perhaps James's most fundamental contribution to psychology, the insight that underlies and informs all his other work. When we try to observe our own consciousness, when we turn our attention inward and attempt to catch ourselves in the act of thinking, what do we find? The traditional answer, inherited from British empiricist philosophers like John Locke and David Hume, was that we find discrete ideas or sensations. Consciousness was conceived as a kind of mental space in which ideas appeared, one after another, associated with each other, according to certain laws, the law of similarity, the law of contiguity, the law of cause and effect. Complex thoughts were understood as combinations of simple ideas, just as complex chemical substances are combinations of simple elements. But James insisted that this picture was fundamentally false to the actual character of experience. When I introspect, I do not find discrete ideas succeeding each other like beads on a string. I find a continuous flow, a stream that is constantly moving and changing but never broken. Even when I sleep and wake, there is a sense of continuity. I know that this is the same consciousness that fell asleep, even though the content has changed. Moreover, the stream of consciousness is not made up only of substantive parts, the clear, focused thoughts that we can easily name and describe. It also includes what James called transitive parts, the fleeting feelings of relation, the sense of and, the feeling of if, the experience of transition from one thought to another. These transitive parts are harder to observe because they disappear when we try to focus on them, like snowflakes melting when we bring them into a warm room. But they are essential to the texture of consciousness. Without them, our experience would indeed be like a series of disconnected snapshots rather than a continuous flow. Consider the simple experience of reading this sentence. If consciousness were composed of discrete sensations, you would experience each word as a separate entity, unconnected to the others. But that is not what reading feels like. Each word flows into the next. Each carries with it an anticipation of what is coming, a reference back to what has already passed. The meaning of the sentence is not in the individual words, but in the relations between them, in the syntactic structure, in the overall pattern. And all of this is given in experience, felt directly, not constructed or inferred. Or consider the experience of thinking about something. Suppose I ask you to think about your childhood home. Your consciousness does not first conjure a separate image of the front door, then the hallway, then the living room, each as a discrete sensation. Rather, the whole house comes to mind in a kind of aura, a felt sense that includes many aspects simultaneously. If I then say, think about the kitchen inn, your childhood home, your consciousness shifts, and certain features become more prominent, but the shift is continuous, not a series of discrete steps. This is what James meant by the stream of consciousness, a flowing, connected, holistic process. The stream of consciousness is also selective. At every moment, an enormous amount of sensory information is available to us. Sights, sounds, smells, tactile sensations, internal bodily states. But we do not attend to all of it equally. Consciousness is constantly choosing, focusing on some aspects of experience while relegating others to the background or ignoring them entirely. This selectivity is not arbitrary. It is guided by our interests, purposes, and past experiences. We notice what is relevant to our current concerns, what fits into our ongoing projects and stories. James described this selectivity with a vivid metaphor. The mind is at every stage a theater of simultaneous possibilities. Consciousness consists in the minor comparison of these with each other, the selection of some, and the suppression of the rest, by the reinforcing and inhibiting agency of attention. Attention, in other words, is the sculptor of consciousness, carving out a coherent experience from the blooming, buzzing confusion of raw sensory input. This selectivity has profound implications. It means that consciousness is not a passive mirror of reality, but an active participant in constructing our experience. Two people observing the same scene may have radically different experiences of it, depending on what they attend to, what they care about, what meanings they bring to it. The bird watcher sees and hears species that are invisible to the person walking beside her. The architect notices structural features that escape the layperson. The psychologist perceives patterns of interaction that others overlook. Reality does not simply impress itself upon us. We actively engage with it, selecting and interpreting according to our interests and frameworks. The personal nature of consciousness is another fundamental feature that James emphasized. My consciousness is mine, and yours is yours, and there is an irreducible subjectivity to each. This seems obvious, perhaps, but it stands in stark contrast to certain philosophical traditions that try to treat consciousness as impersonal or universal. For James, consciousness is always someone's consciousness, always experienced from a particular perspective, always colored by particular memories, concerns, and temperaments. This personal character of consciousness is connected to what James called the self. When I think about my past, I do not simply recall events as objective facts. I recall them as things that happened to me, as parts of my story. There is a sense of ownership, of personal continuity that runs through all my experiences. This self is not a static entity, not a soul substance that persists unchanged through time. Rather, it is a process, a sense of continuity that consciousness constructs and maintains. The self is the felt unity of the stream of consciousness across time. Yet this unity is not always perfect. James acknowledged that consciousness can become divided, conflicted, split into competing currents. In moments of moral struggle, we may feel torn between different impulses or values. In certain pathological states, such as dissociative disorders, the normal unity of consciousness may fragment into separate personalities or streams of awareness. These phenomena suggest that the self is not a given but an achievement, something that consciousness actively constructs and maintains. The stream of consciousness is also characterized by its constant change. James insisted that no state of consciousness can recur identically. We can never step into the same mental river twice. Even if we think the same thought, I am hungry, for example, on two different occasions, the thought is not identical because it occurs in a different context, against a different background of preceding thoughts and circumstances. The I who is hungry now is different from the I who was hungry yesterday, if only because I now have the memory of yesterday's hunger. This emphasis on change and process was part of James's broader philosophical vision. He was deeply influenced by evolutionary biology and by the philosophy of process thinkers like Henri Bergson. He saw the universe itself as fundamentally dynamic, characterized by becoming rather than being, by creativity and novelty rather than fixed essences. Consciousness, as part of this universe, participates in this fundamental dynamism. Finally, consciousness is always intentional. It is always directed towards something beyond itself. When I am conscious of something. I see the tree. I remember the conversation. I anticipate the meeting. Consciousness is not a self-enclosed realm, but a reaching out toward the world. This intentionality connects our inner experience with outer reality, bridging the supposed gap between mind and world. This feature of consciousness, its directedness, its aboutness, would become central to the phenomenological movement in philosophy, developed by thinkers like Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. But James articulated it first, in his own distinctive way, as part of his description of the stream of consciousness. Now, this stream of consciousness, with all its complexity and dynamism, does not float free of the body. James was insistent that consciousness is embodied, that it is intimately connected with physiological processes. This was part of what made his psychology biological rather than purely philosophical. He understood that the brain is the organ of the mind, that neural processes underlie conscious experiences, that injuries to the brain can alter personality and cognition. But James was equally insistent that consciousness cannot be reduced to brain processes. The relationship between mind and brain is not one of simple identity. Consciousness, as we experience it, has qualities redness, sweetness, painfulness that seem irreducible to patterns of neural firing. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, and James was acutely aware of it. He did not claim to solve it, but he refused to make it disappear by fiat. By simply asserting that consciousness is nothing but brain activity. Instead, James explored various models of the mind-body relationship. At different times, he entertained different possibilities. In some writings, he suggested a kind of dualism, a real distinction between mental and physical substances. In others, he moved toward a neutral monism, the view that mind and matter are two aspects of a more fundamental reality. In his later doctrine of radical empiricism, he suggested that experience itself is the fundamental reality, and that mind and matter are abstractions from pure experience. What remained constant throughout these explorations was James's commitment to taking both consciousness and physiology seriously, to refusing easy reductionisms in either direction. The mind is embodied, connected to the brain, shaped by biological evolution, but it is also real in its own right, with its own causal powers, its own distinctive qualities. To understand human beings, we must understand both the neural machinery and the experienced stream of consciousness, and we must understand how they interact. Let us now turn to James's radical empiricism, for this philosophical stance underlies and justifies his psychological method. Empiricism, in philosophy, is the view that knowledge comes from experience rather than from pure reason or innate ideas. But traditional empiricism, as developed by philosophers like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, tended to focus narrowly on sensory experience, on sights, sounds, tastes, touches, smells. These sensory experiences were treated as the basic building blocks of knowledge, and everything else was understood as derived from or composed of these simple sensory elements. James agreed that experience is the source of knowledge, but he argued that traditional empiricism was far too narrow in what it counted as. Experience. Experience is not just a collection of discrete sensations. It includes relations, transitions, feelings of and but, and with. It includes the sense of continuity, the feeling of purpose, the experience of meaning. All of these are given in experience, felt directly, not constructed or inferred. To be truly empirical, we must acknowledge the full richness of experience, not just the aspects that are easy to isolate and measure. This is what makes James's empiricism radical. It refuses to privilege certain aspects of experience over others based on theoretical preconceptions. It insists on including all aspects of experience, the transitive as well as the substantive, the relational as well as the grances, qualitative, the vague and implicit as well as the clear and distinct. Radical empiricism has several important implications. First, it means that introspection is a legitimate method for psychology. If we want to understand consciousness, we must pay attention to how it actually feels, not just to what can be measured in a laboratory. Of course, introspection must be done carefully, with awareness of its limitations and potential biases, but it cannot be eliminated from psychology without eliminating the subject matter itself. Second, radical empiricism suggests that the world as we experience it is more than just a collection of physical objects obeying mechanical laws. Our experience includes values, meanings, purposes, and relations, and these are just as real, just as much a part of the world as atoms and forces. To reduce the world to the purely physical is to impoverish reality, to ignore much of what is given in experience. Third, radical empiricism supports a pluralistic metaphysics. If we take experience as our guide, we find not a single unified system, but a world of diverse, loosely connected processes and events. The universe is not one but many, not a cosmos, but a pluriverse. This pluralism was central to James's philosophical vision, and it stood in stark contrast to the monistic systems of absolute idealists and mechanistic materialists alike. Now let us turn to James' pragmatism, the philosophical method that he developed and popularized, and that became his most influential contribution to philosophy. Pragmatism, as James understood it, was not a doctrine but a method, a way of settling philosophical disputes by examining the practical consequences of competing ideas. The pragmatic method asks, what difference would it make to our experience if this idea were true rather than that one? If two ideas have identical practical consequences, if they lead to the same predictions and the same actions, then the dispute between them is merely verbal, a matter of words rather than substance. But if the ideas lead to different consequences, then there is a real difference, and we can adjudicate between them by examining which consequences are more satisfactory. Consider, for example, the debate between free will and determinism. Determinists say that every event, including every human action, is the necessary result of prior causes. Libertarians say that human beings have genuine freedom, that we could have done otherwise than we did. Pragmatism asks, what difference does it make? If I believe in determinism, will I behave differently than if I believe in free will? Will my attitudes toward responsibility, regret, and aspiration change? If the answer is yes, and for most people it is, then the dispute is not merely verbal, but has real practical significance. James believed that the doctrine of free will made a practical difference. It supported attitudes of moral responsibility, effort, and hope. It made sense of our experience of deliberation and choice. Therefore, given that the theoretical arguments for determinism and free will are inconclusive, we have the right to believe in free will based on its practical benefits. This is an application of the will to believe, choosing the belief that works best when purely intellectual evidence is insufficient. Pragmatism also offers a distinctive theory of truth. For James, truth is not a static correspondence between an idea and reality, something fixed and eternal. Rather, truth is a process, something that happens to an idea. An idea becomes true through verification in experience. A true idea is one that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. A false idea is one that leads to contradictions, disappointments, and failed predictions. This might sound like truth is merely subjective or relative, but James insisted that it is not. True ideas are constrained by reality. They must cohere with our other beliefs, must lead to successful predictions and actions, must help us navigate the world effectively. An idea that conflicts with well-established facts or that leads to disastrous consequences is not made true simply because someone believes it or finds it useful. Truth is objective, but it is also dynamic and contextual. Different truths may be appropriate for different purposes and contexts. The truths of physics are useful for predicting the behavior of material objects. The truths of psychology are useful for understanding human behavior. The truths of religion are useful for orienting our lives toward what we hold sacred. These different kinds of truths are not necessarily in conflict. They operate in different domains, answering different questions, guiding different aspects of life. James applied the pragmatic method to metaphysical questions. He argued that the traditional disputes of metaphysics between monism and pluralism, idealism and materialism, theism and atheism should be evaluated based on their practical consequences. Which view makes better sense of experience? Which supports more satisfactory attitudes and behaviors? Which opens up more possibilities for thought and action? When James applied this method, he found himself drawn to pluralism over monism, to an open universe over a closed one, to a vision of reality as unfinished and in the making rather than complete and determinate. He found the monistic vision of absolute idealism, the idea that all of reality is one unified system, perfectly rational and complete to be stifling and false to experience. Experience shows us a world that is messy, diverse, and open-ended, a world where genuine novelty occurs, where things might have been otherwise. Similarly, James was drawn to what he called a melioristic worldview, the view that the universe is neither perfectly good, as optimists claim, nor irredeemably evil, as pessimists claim, but capable of improvement through effort. We live in an unfinished universe, and our choices make a real difference to how it turns out. This view, James believed, best supports moral engagement and hope without lapsing into naivety or despair. Now, let us return to James's exploration of religious experience, for this is where his pragmatism, his radical empiricism, and his psychological insight all come together. In the varieties of religious experience, James approached religion not as a set of doctrines to be believed or institutions to be obeyed, but as a domain of lived experience to be studied empirically and evaluated pragmatically. What interested James was not theology, but the actual experiences of religious individuals, the moments of conversion, the sense of divine presence, the mystical states, the transformed lives of saints. He collected hundreds of accounts of such experiences and analyzed them for common patterns and psychological dynamics. One of James's key insights was that religious experiences are characterized by a distinctive phenomenology, a particular quality of feeling and knowing. Religious experiences typically involve a sense of the more, a feeling that there is something beyond the ordinary, visible world, something numinous and significant. This more is felt as real, as present, often more real than the ordinary furniture of daily life. It is experienced not as a concept or hypothesis, but as a living reality, something directly apprehended. Religious experiences also often involve a sense of union or harmony with this more. The ordinary boundaries of the self seem to dissolve or become permeable. There is a feeling of being connected to something larger, of participating in a reality that transcends individual existence. This sense of union is typically accompanied by profound emotions, peace, joy, love, gratitude, awe. It feels not like losing oneself, but like finding one's true self, one's deepest identity. These experiences can be sudden and dramatic, as in classic conversion experiences, or they can be gradual and subtle, a slow growth into faith and practice. But in either case, they have common features: a shift from a state of incompleteness or struggle to a state of wholeness and peace, a sense of new insight or vision, a transformation of values and priorities, and often a lasting change in character and conduct. James was particularly interested in mystical experiences, those intense moments of apparent direct contact with the divine or ultimate reality. Mystics across different religious traditions report remarkably similar experiences: a sense of unity with the cosmos or with God, a feeling of transcending time and space, a perception of the ultimate as ineffable and paradoxical beyond all categories and distinctions, a conviction of having gained profound knowledge or insight, and a sense of overwhelming joy, peace, or love. These mystical experiences, James noted, have a noetic quality. They feel like states of knowledge, not just states of feeling. The mystic returns from the experience convinced that he or she has perceived a truth that rational thought cannot reach. And yet, the experience cannot be adequately communicated. Words fail. All descriptions seem inadequate. The mystic can point toward the experience, can use metaphors and negations, but cannot directly convey what was experienced. What should we make of these experiences? Are they genuine perceptions of a transcendent reality, or are they merely subjective states, perhaps even pathological ones? James approached this question with his characteristic combination of openness and critical scrutiny. On the one hand, he refused to dismiss mystical experiences as delusions. They are real psychological phenomena with profound effects. People who have mystical experiences often undergo lasting transformations. They become more compassionate, more serene, more oriented toward the transcendent. This suggests that something significant is happening, not merely a brain malfunction. On the other hand, James did not claim that mystical experiences prove the existence of God or the truth of any particular religious doctrine. Mystical experiences vary across cultures and traditions. Christians experience Christ, Buddhists experience emptiness, Hindus experience Brahman. This suggests that the interpretation of mystical experiences is shaped by the religious and cultural framework of the experiencer. The raw experience may be universal, but the conceptualization is culturally specific. Moreover, mystical experiences, however profound they feel to the person having them, do not have authority for others. You cannot use your mystical experience to prove God's existence to me, any more than you can use your toothache to prove to me that your tooth hurts. Experiences are self-authenticating for the person who has them, but not necessarily for others. So, what can we conclude? James suggested that religious experiences point to the existence of a subconscious dimension of the psyche, a realm of the mind that extends beyond ordinary waking consciousness. In mystical states, the ordinary ego consciousness gives way to something larger, something that feels continuous with a greater spiritual reality. Whether this subconscious realm actually connects with a transcendent divine reality, or whether it is entirely within the natural order, James left as an open question. But he insisted that religious experiences are data that any comprehensive psychology must take seriously. James also explored the pragmatic dimensions of religious belief. What are the practical consequences of believing in God, in an afterlife, in a moral order to the universe? For many people, religious beliefs provide comfort in suffering, strength in trials, moral guidance, and a sense of ultimate meaning and purpose. These are not trivial benefits. They can make the difference between despair and hope, between breakdown and resilience. James argued that religious beliefs should be evaluated, at least in part, by their fruits, by how they affect the lives of believers. Do they make people more loving, more courageous, more generous, or do they make people narrow, fearful, and judgmental? Different forms of religion have different effects, and we can distinguish healthy religious attitudes from pathological ones based on these consequences. But James went further. He argued that religious faith can sometimes create its own verification. If I believe that the universe is friendly, that there is a divine support available to me, I may act with courage and hope that would be impossible if I believed the universe were indifferent or hostile. And by acting with courage and hope, I may encounter experiences, synchronicities, feelings of grace, transformed relationships that confirm my faith. The faith does not follow from proof. Rather, the faith enables experiences that feel like proof. This is, of course, a controversial claim. It seems to license believing anything that makes us feel good. But James insisted that the will to believe has limits. We are entitled to believe only when the option is live, genuinely possible for us. Forced, we must choose one way or the other. And momentous, the stakes are high. And even then, our beliefs must still answer to experience. If my faith leads to actions that consistently fail, if it conflicts with well-established facts, if it produces bad fruits in my life, then it is not pragmatically vindicated. James's approach to religious experience and religious belief was thus a middle path between dogmatic belief and dismissive skepticism. He took religious experiences seriously as real psychological phenomena worthy of study. He evaluated religious beliefs pragmatically based on their effects. He remained agnostic about ultimate metaphysical questions, acknowledging that we may never have definitive proof one way or the other. But he defended the right to believe, the right to make a leap of faith when intellectual evidence is insufficient and the stakes are high. This stance has been enormously influential. It provided a framework for studying religion empirically without reducing it to mere illusion. It legitimized the exploration of mysticism and altered states of consciousness. It offered a way of being intellectually honest while remaining open to spiritual experience, and it resonated with many people who found themselves between traditional religious certainty and modern scientific skepticism, seeking a middle way that honored both reason and faith. Now, as we move deeper into James's vision, let us consider his concept of pure experience and his metaphysical proposal of radical empiricism as a worldview. In his later philosophical writings, particularly in essays collected in the volumes Essays in Radical Empiricism and a Pluralistic Universe, James developed a metaphysical vision that attempted to overcome the traditional dualism of mind and matter. The problem, as James saw it, was that modern philosophy had split the world into two fundamentally different substances, mental and physical. The mental realm contained thoughts, feelings, and consciousness. The physical realm contained matter, energy, and mechanical causation. But this split created intractable problems. How do mind and matter interact? How can physical processes in the brain give rise to conscious experiences? Conversely, how can mental intentions cause physical actions? James proposed a radical solution. Perhaps mind and matter are not two different substances, but two different ways of organizing the same underlying reality. That underlying reality, James suggested, is pure experience. Experience that is not yet classified as mental or physical, subjective or objective. Consider your experience right now. You are aware of something, perhaps the words on a page, or sounds in the room, or sensations in your body. This experience is neither purely mental nor purely physical. It is prior to that distinction. It becomes mental when we consider it from the standpoint of personal consciousness, when we ask what you are experiencing. It becomes physical when we consider it from the standpoint of its causal relations with other events, when we ask what stimuli produced it and what effects it will have. In other words, the same event, the same bit of pure experience, can be part of both the mental and the physical order, depending on how we contextualize it. My experience of seeing a tree is mental insofar as it is part of my stream of consciousness, my personal biography, but the very same experience is physical insofar as it is caused by light reflecting off the tree, triggering receptors in my retina, and so on. Experience is not duplicated once as a mental event and once as a physical event. Rather, the single experience participates in both orders simultaneously. This view, if it can be sustained, dissolves the mind-body problem. There is no mysterious interaction between two different substances because there are not two substances to begin with. There is only pure experience, organized in different ways, participating in different causal chains. Mind and matter are functional distinctions, not ontological ones. James acknowledged that this view was speculative and worked out its details only partially. But he believed it pointed in a promising direction, one that took experience seriously as the fundamental reality and avoided the pitfalls of both materialism and idealism. This metaphysical vision was connected to James's pluralism. If the universe is fundamentally experiential, then it is not a single unified system, but a network of overlapping and interacting streams of experience. My consciousness is one such stream, yours is another. And perhaps there are many others animal consciousnesses, perhaps even something like consciousness in nature itself, though James was cautious about such speculations. This pluralistic universe is characterized by what James called external relations. This was a technical philosophical term, but the basic idea is important. In a pluralistic universe, things can be genuinely separate, genuinely distinct, genuinely independent of each other. Relations between things are real, but do not eliminate the separateness of the things related. You and I are connected in various ways. We share a planet. We are part of the same species. We participate in overlapping networks of meaning and causation. But we are also genuinely distinct. Your consciousness is not my consciousness. What happens to you does not automatically happen to me. This might seem obvious, but it contradicts the views of absolute idealists, who argued that all distinctions are ultimately illusory, that the universe is fundamentally one unified whole in which all apparent separations are transcended. James found this view intellectually elegant, but experientially false. Our experience shows us a world of genuine plurality, genuine separateness, genuine contingency. To deny this is to impose an abstract theory over the concrete texture of lived reality. The pluralistic universe also has moral implications. If the universe is not a completed system, but an open, evolving, unfinished reality, then our choices matter. The future is not already determined. What we do makes a real difference. Moral effort is not futile or illusory. We are genuine participants in the creation of the future, co-creators of the world as it unfolds. This vision is what James called meliorism, the view that the world can be made better through effort, that it is neither predetermined to be perfect nor condemned to be evil, but genuinely open to improvement. Meliorism steers between naive optimism and cynical pessimism. It acknowledges the reality of suffering and evil, but insists that progress is possible. It calls for engagement, work, for moral seriousness, without guaranteeing success. James's meliorism was connected to his vision of God. Unlike traditional theism, which conceived of God as omnipotent, omniscient, and perfect, James entertained the possibility of a finite God, a God who is not all-powerful, but is working within the constraints of the world to bring about good. This God needs our help, our cooperation, our moral effort. We are not just servants of an all-powerful master, but co-workers in the project of improving the universe. This idea of a finite God was controversial, even heretical by traditional theological standards. But for James, it made better sense of experience. It explained why evil exists not as part of a divine plan that we cannot understand, but as a genuine problem, a real challenge that both God and humanity must confront. It made moral effort meaningful, not as obedience to an arbitrary will, but as participation in a genuinely important project. And it allowed for a more personal, intimate relationship with the divine, not the relationship of creature to absolute sovereign, but the relationship of co-workers in a common cause. James knew that these ideas were speculative, that they went beyond what could be proven empirically. But he offered them as live options, as possibilities worth considering, as frameworks that might make better sense of our experience than the traditional alternatives. And he insisted that we have the right to believe them if they work for us, if they support a richer, more meaningful, more engaged life. Throughout all of his work, from the principles of psychology to the varieties of religious experience, from his essays on pragmatism to his speculations on pure experience, William James remained committed to several core values. First, fidelity. to experience the insistence that philosophy and psychology must remain faithful to how things actually feel, how consciousness actually flows, how life is actually lived, rather than imposing abstract theories that distort or oversimplify reality. Second, openness to the full range of human experience, not just the sensory and rational, but also the mystical, the emotional, the moral, the aesthetic. James refused to privilege any one dimension of experience as more real or more important than others. He wanted a psychology and philosophy that could accommodate all of it, that could make sense of scientific investigation and religious ecstasy, of logical reasoning and moral passion, of artistic creation and contemplative insight. Third, respect for individuality and plurality. The recognition that different people have different temperaments, different needs, different ways of experiencing and understanding the world, and that there is no single truth, no single path, no single framework that will work for everyone. Philosophy, James believed, is personal. It must answer to the specific needs and experiences of the individual. Philosopher. What works for me may not work for you, and that is not a defect, but a reflection of the genuine plurality of the universe. Fourth, emphasis on practice and consequences, the insistence that ideas are tools, that their value lies in how they help us navigate the world, cope with challenges, find meaning and purpose. Abstract speculation disconnected from life is empty. Philosophy must make a difference to how we live, or it is not worth pursuing. And fifth, a sense of openness and uncertainty, the recognition that we do not have final answers, that the universe is larger and more mysterious than our theories, that we must remain humble, curious, willing to revise our views in light of new experience. James was deeply skeptical of dogmatism, whether scientific or religious. He believed that the universe is too rich, too complex, too open-ended to be captured in any final system. These values made James an enormously attractive figure to many people. His writings combined intellectual rigor with personal warmth, philosophical depth with psychological insight, scientific curiosity with spiritual openness. He spoke to the whole person, not just to the intellect. He addressed the questions that actually matter to human beings, questions of meaning, purpose, value, faith, identity, freedom, and he did so with honesty, nuance, and empathy. His influence on subsequent thought has been profound and wide-ranging. In psychology, James established the functional approach, the idea that mental processes must be understood in terms of their adaptive purposes. This approach became dominant in American psychology and influenced the development of behaviorism, cognitive psychology, and evolutionary psychology. His introspective method and his emphasis on conscious experience inspired phenomenological psychology and continue to inform contemporary work on consciousness and subjective experience. In philosophy, James was one of the founders of pragmatism, one of the most distinctively American contributions to world philosophy. Pragmatism influenced the work of John Dewey, who applied it to education, politics, and social reform. It influenced later analytic philosophers like W.V.O. Quine and Hilary Putnam. It crossed the Atlantic and influenced European philosophers like F.C.S. Schiller, and it has seen a revival in recent decades, with neo-pragmatists like Richard Rorty and Cornel West drawing on Jamesian themes. In religious studies, James's Varieties of Religious Experience established the psychological study of religion as a legitimate academic field. It influenced scholars like Rudolf Otto, Mircea Eliade, and Houston Smith. It provided a framework for understanding mysticism, conversion, and spiritual experience that continues to be used today. And it resonated with the spiritual seekers of the 20th century, people who were disillusioned with institutional religion but still hungry for transcendence and meaning. James's influence also extended to literature and the arts. His brother Henry's novels employed stream of consciousness narration, a technique that may have been influenced by William's psychological theories. Modernist writers like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and William Faulkner would develop this technique further, using it to render the flowing, nonlinear nature of consciousness. William James's ideas about the fluidity of consciousness, the role of the subconscious, and the plurality of perspectives helped shape the literary sensibility of modernism. In the realm of spirituality and self-help, James's ideas have had an enormous, if sometimes unacknowledged, influence. His emphasis on the power of belief, on the ability to transform one's life through a change of attitude, on the importance of will and effort, resonates through countless self-help books and motivational programs. His as-if philosophy, acting as if you're confident, as if you're happy, as if you can succeed, and thereby actually becoming those things, has become a staple of practical psychology and personal development. More recently, James's ideas have found new relevance in cognitive science and the philosophy of mind. His functionalism, the idea that mental states are defined by their functional roles rather than by their intrinsic properties, anticipated key ideas in contemporary cognitive science. His emphasis on embodied cognition, the idea that the mind is not separate from the body but intimately connected with it, resonates with current research on how bodily states influence emotion and cognition. His openness to altered states of consciousness has inspired contemporary research on meditation, psychedelics, and mystical experiences. James's pluralism and his critique of reductionism have also found echoes in contemporary philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. Many philosophers today argue against the idea that psychology can be reduced to neuroscience, that neuroscience can be reduced to chemistry, that chemistry can be reduced to physics in a simple, linear hierarchy. Instead, they argue for a more pluralistic view, in which different levels of description and different frameworks are all valid and useful in their own domains. This is very much in the spirit of James's pragmatism and pluralism. Now, as we drift deeper into reflection, let us consider what William James's work means for us today, for our understanding of ourselves, for our struggle to find meaning in a complex and often bewildering world. What can this thinker from more than a century ago still teach us? First, James reminds us of the primacy of experience. In an age of big data, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence, it is easy to forget that consciousness, the felt, lived, subjective experience of being someone, is the starting point of all knowledge. We do not first know the brain and then infer consciousness. We first know consciousness and then investigate the brain. As Thomas Nagel famously put it, there is something it is like to be a conscious being, and this subjective, what it's like, cannot be eliminated or reduced to objective descriptions. James invites us to pay attention to our experience, to notice its texture, its flow, its nuances. He teaches us to be phenomenologists of our own minds, to observe how attention shifts, how memories arise, how feelings color perceptions, how intentions guide actions. This attentiveness to experience is valuable not just for psychological understanding, but for living a fuller, more awakened life. When we are caught up in abstractions, in plans and worries, in the constant chatter of the internal monologue, we lose touch with the richness of immediate experience. James points us back to the stream itself, invites us to wade into it, to feel its current. Second, James reminds us of the wholeness of human experience. He refused to divide human beings into separate compartments, the rational, the emotional, the spiritual, the bodily, and to privilege some over others. He insisted that we are embodied minds and minded bodies, that reason and emotion are intertwined, that the spiritual is part of the natural. He made room in his psychology for everything human, for intellect and passion, for science and mysticism, for calculation and wonder. In our own time, we often feel fragmented, split into different roles and identities. At work, we are expected to be rational, efficient, professional. At home, we are expected to be loving, attentive, present. In our leisure, we are supposed to relax, to have fun, to consume. We shuttle between these different modes, and we may feel that no single place allows us to be whole, to integrate all the dimensions of our being. James offers a vision of integration, of bringing together the different aspects of ourselves into a coherent, functioning whole. He shows us that thinking can be passionate, that spirituality can be intellectually honest, that practicality can be compatible with idealism. He models a way of being in the world that is both scientifically curious and spiritually open, both hard-headed and tender-hearted. Third, James reminds us of the importance of choice and will. In the late 19th century, the dominant scientific worldview was deterministic. The universe was seen as a giant machine, operating according to fixed laws, with every event determined by prior causes. Human beings were parts of this machine, and our sense of freedom was an illusion. This determinism led, for some people, to a kind of paralysis or despair. If everything is determined, if we have no real freedom, then why bother trying? Why make any effort at all? James fought against this deterministic vision, not by denying the role of causation, but by insisting on the reality of novelty, creativity, and genuine choice. He argued that the future is open, that our choices make a real difference, that we are not merely passive observers of a predetermined script, but active participants in a drama whose ending is not yet written. This message is, if anything, more important today. We live in an age of anxiety about the future, about climate change, about technological disruption, about political instability, about personal insecurity. It is easy to feel powerless, to think that the big forces, economic, technological, environmental, are beyond our control, and that our individual actions don't matter. James would say, yes, the forces are large and the challenges are real, but you are not powerless. Your choices do matter. The universe is not a closed system but an open one, and what you do contributes to how it unfolds. You are a co-creator of the future. This is both a burden and an opportunity. It means you cannot escape responsibility, you cannot blame everything on fate or circumstance. But it also means you have agency, power, the ability to make a difference. Fourth, James reminds us of the value of faith in the face of uncertainty. We live in a time of radical uncertainty. The old verities, religious, political, moral, epistemological, have been called into question. We are told to follow the science, but the science itself is complex, contested, and constantly evolving. We are told to think critically, but critical thinking can spiral into skepticism, into the paralysis of endless doubt. James offers a way forward. He acknowledges that certainty is rare, that on many of the most important questions of life, is there a God? Is there meaning? What should I do with my life? The evidence is ambiguous, but he insists that we can still commit, still choose, still act, even in the absence of proof. The will to believe is not irrationality. It is a recognition that life requires action, that we cannot wait for certainty before we commit to values, relationships, and projects. This is not a license for wishful thinking or self-deception. James insists that our beliefs must still answer to experience, must still be tested by their fruits. A faith that leads to cruelty, narrowness, and closed-mindedness is a bad faith. But a faith that opens us to deeper experience, that makes us more loving and courageous, that connects us to something larger than ourselves, this is a faith worth having, even if we cannot prove it intellectually. Fifth, James reminds us of the reality and importance of the subjective, the qualitative, the felt dimension of life. In our data-driven, quantified world, there is a tendency to value only what can be measured, only what can be expressed in numbers, only what can be captured in algorithms. But as James knew, the most important things in life, love, beauty, meaning, purpose, joy, suffering, are not quantifiable. They are qualitative, subjective, felt. To ignore this dimension is to impoverish our understanding of reality. It leads to what James called vicious abstractionism, the fallacy of treating abstractions as more real than the concrete experiences from which they are abstracted. Numbers are useful, models are useful, theories are useful, but they are tools, not reality itself. Reality is the lived, felt, messy, rich flow of experience, and we must never lose sight of that. Sixth, James reminds us of the value of pluralism, both metaphysical and moral. In a pluralistic universe, there is no single truth, no single right way to live, no single perspective that captures everything. Different people have different needs, different temperaments, different paths. What works for me may not work for you. This is not relativism. James believed in truth and value, but it is a recognition that truth and value are contextual, that they take different forms for different people in different situations. This pluralism is important in our own time, as we navigate a world of increasing diversity, cultural, religious, moral, epistemological. We are confronted with competing worldviews, competing values, competing claims to truth. James's pluralism offers a middle way between rigid dogmatism and nihilistic relativism. It says, yes, there are many perspectives, and we should respect them. But not all perspectives are equally valid or equally useful. We can still judge, still evaluate, still prefer some views over others, based on their consequences, their coherence, their fruits in our lives. Seventh, James reminds us of the possibility of transformation. His study of religious conversion, of mystical experiences, of the transformed lives of saints, reveals that human beings are not fixed, not determined by their past, not trapped in their current state. Radical change is possible. A person who is despairing can become hopeful. A person who is selfish can become generous. A person who is lost can find meaning and direction. This possibility of transformation is not guaranteed, and it often requires crisis, effort, and grace. But it is real. James's own life exemplified it. He passed through a period of profound depression and suicidal ideation in his youth, and he emerged from it not just recovered but transformed, able to create a body of work that would inspire and enlighten millions. In our own lives, we may feel stuck, trapped in patterns of thought and behavior that we cannot seem to change. James reminds us that transformation is possible, that the stream of consciousness is not a fixed thing, but a flowing, dynamic process that can shift its course. Sometimes the shift comes gradually, through sustained effort and practice. Sometimes it comes suddenly, through a moment of insight or grace. But it is always possible. Eighth, James reminds us to trust our experience. In an age of experts, authorities, and institutions, we are often told not to trust our own perceptions, feelings, and intuitions. We are told that our experience is subjective, biased, unreliable, and that we should defer to objective data, scientific studies, expert opinion. James would not deny the value of science and expertise. He was a scientist himself, committed to empirical investigation and rational argument. But he also insisted that each person's experience is valid, is data, is a window onto reality. Your pain is real, your joy is real, your sense of meaning or meaninglessness is real. These are not illusions to be dismissed, but facts to be taken seriously. This trust in experience does not mean that we should be uncritical or that we should never revise our views. James was acutely aware of the ways in which perception can be distorted, memory can be unreliable, and interpretation can be biased. But he insisted that the starting point must be respect for experience, not dismissal of it. We can question and refine our interpretations, but we cannot question whether we are experiencing what we are experiencing. Ninth, James reminds us of the interconnection of mind and body, of thought and feeling, of consciousness and action. His theory of emotion, his exploration of habit, his emphasis on the embodied nature of consciousness, all point to the same insight. We are not disembodied minds, but embodied beings, and our mental life is intimately connected with our physical life. This has practical implications. If we want to change our minds, we may need to change our bodies, our posture, our breathing, our movement. If we want to change our emotions, we may need to change our actions. If we want to become courageous, we should act courageously, and the feeling of courage will follow. This is not just motivational rhetoric. It is grounded in James's understanding of how the mind-body system works. In our own time, with increasing awareness of the importance of physical health for mental health, of exercise for mood, of meditation for attention, of somatic practices for trauma healing, James's insights seem prescient. He was ahead of his time in recognizing that the mind is embodied and that we must work with the body if we want to transform the mind. 10th, James reminds us of the mystery at the heart of existence. For all his scientific rigor and philosophical clarity, James never claimed to have final answers. He remained open to mystery, to the unknown, to the possibility that reality is stranger and richer than our theories. He was willing to entertain unusual ideas, psychical research, a finite God, panpsychism not because he was credulous, but because he refused to foreclose possibilities prematurely. This openness to mystery is a kind of intellectual humility, a recognition that we do not know everything, that our current frameworks may be incomplete or inadequate, that new experiences and new evidence may require us to revise our views. It is also a spiritual stance, an acknowledgement that existence is ultimately mysterious, that the universe contains depths that we may never fully fathom. In an age that often oscillates between dogmatic certainty and cynical skepticism, James models a third way, a curious, open, humble engagement with the mystery of existence. He shows us that it is possible to be rigorously intellectual without being close-minded, to be scientifically informed without being reductionistic, to be spiritually open without being gullible. As we consider James's legacy, we might also reflect on the particular character of his thought. There is a quality to James's writing that is hard to describe, but instantly recognizable once you've encountered it. It is warm, personal, almost conversational. He writes as if he is speaking directly to you, as if he is working through the problem together with you rather than lecturing from on high. He uses vivid examples, concrete images, everyday language. He is not afraid to be tentative, to say, "It seems to me," or "I am inclined to think," rather than "It is certainly the case." This style is not just a matter of rhetoric. It reflects James's philosophical commitments. He believed that philosophy is personal, that it arises from lived experience and must answer to lived experience. He rejected the ideal of philosophy as an impersonal, objective system built from self-evident axioms. He saw philosophy as a human endeavor, shaped by temperament, experience, values, and the particularities of the philosopher's life. James distinguished between tough-minded and tender-minded philosophers. The tough-minded are empiricist, skeptical, materialistic, irreligious, fatalistic, pluralistic, interested in facts and parts. The tender-minded are rationalistic, idealistic, optimistic, religious, believing in free will, monistic, interested in principles and wholes. James himself tried to find a middle way, a position that could satisfy both the tough-minded demand for empirical rigor and the tender-minded need for meaning and value. This effort to bridge divides between science and religion, between tough-mindedness and tender-mindedness, between empiricism and idealism, is characteristic of James. He was a synthesizer, a bridge builder, someone who tried to find common ground and to show how apparently contradictory positions might both capture important truths. In our own polarized time, when we are often told that we must choose sides, that we must be either rational or spiritual, either scientific or humanistic, either skeptical or believing, James reminds us that these are false dichotomies. We can be both, and rather than either, or. We can use science to investigate the world without reducing everything to matter and mechanism. We can be open to spiritual experience without abandoning critical thinking. We can acknowledge the reality of suffering and evil without lapsing into despair. We can affirm human freedom and responsibility without denying the role of causation and constraint. James's vision is ultimately an optimistic one, or more precisely, a melioristic one. He believed that the universe is not perfect but is capable of improvement, that human effort matters, that our choices make a difference. He believed that consciousness is not an epiphenomenon, a mere byproduct of brain processes with no causal power, but a real force in the world, shaping events through attention, intention, and will. He believed that meaning is not imposed from outside or discovered in some transcendent realm, but created by conscious beings as they engage with the world and with each other. This vision gives significance to human life. We are not just insignificant specks in a vast, indifferent cosmos. We are participants in the creation of meaning, agents in the unfolding of the universe, co-creators of the future. This is both exhilarating and terrifying. It means we cannot escape responsibility. We cannot say that the way things are is the way they had to be, that we had no choice, that it doesn't matter what we do. We are responsible for the world we create, individually and collectively. But this responsibility is also empowering. It means we are not victims of fate, not puppets of deterministic forces. We have real freedom, real agency, real power to shape our lives and our world. The stream of consciousness is our stream, flowing according to our attention and intention. The choices we make are real choices, with real consequences. The meanings we create are real meanings, structuring our experience and guiding our actions. As we near the end of our journey through William James's life and thought, let us return to where we began, to the stream of consciousness, that flowing river of experience that is the most intimate and immediate fact of our existence. Right now, as you listen to or read these words, consciousness is flowing. Thoughts arise and pass away. Sensations come and go. Memories flicker. Anticipations form. The whole complex, dynamic, living process of experiencing continues moment by moment, never still, never repeating itself exactly, yet retaining a sense of continuity, a sense that this is your consciousness, your life, your experience. James invites us to notice this stream, to pay attention to it, to honor it, not to analyze it to death, not to freeze it into static categories, but to appreciate it as it flows. This act of noticing is itself a form of mindfulness, a practice of being present to our own experience. And in being present to our experience, we may find a kind of richness, a kind of aliveness that is easily lost in the abstractions and routines of daily life. The stream of consciousness connects us to the world. It is not a private inner realm cut off from external reality. It is the meeting place of self and world, the place where the world appears to us and we respond to the world. When I see the tree enters my consciousness, becomes part of my experience, and my seeing of the tree is shaped by my interests, my past experiences, my concepts and expectations. Consciousness is thus a transaction, a continuous exchange between organism and environment, self and world. This transactional view dissolves many traditional philosophical puzzles. We do not need to ask how a disembodied mind can know an external world, because mind and world are not separate to begin with. They are abstractions from the concrete flow of experience in which both are given together, in relation. Epistemology, the theory of knowledge, is not a matter of building a bridge from mind to world, but of articulating how the mind-world transaction actually works, how consciousness is always already engaged with reality. James's vision also has political and ethical implications, though he developed these less fully than some of his students, particularly John Dewey. A pluralistic universe, in which there are many centers of experience, many perspectives, many goods, calls for a pluralistic society, one that respects diversity and allows for multiple ways of living. It calls for democracy, not as a mere political procedure, but as a moral ideal, a commitment to respecting the agency and experience of all persons. A melioristic worldview, in which improvement is possible but not guaranteed, calls for social engagement, for working to make the world better. It rejects both complacent optimism and resigned pessimism. Things can get better, but only if we work at it. Injustice can be overcome, but only through effort. This makes moral and political action meaningful and urgent. An embodied, pragmatic approach to knowledge calls for experimentation, for testing ideas in practice rather than debating them in the abstract. It values practical wisdom over theoretical speculation. It asks not, is this idea true in some absolute sense? But does this idea work? Does it help us solve problems, navigate challenges, live better lives? These themes were developed more fully by Dewey and other pragmatist thinkers, but they are present in James' work, particularly in his emphasis on the practical consequences of ideas and his insistence that philosophy must make a difference to how we live. As we reflect on James's legacy, we might also consider the limitations of his thought. Like any thinker, James was a product of his time and place, and there are aspects of his work that now seem dated or problematic. His casual use of terms like healthy-minded and sick soul, for example, can seem overly simplistic or even pathologizing. His focus on individual religious experience can seem to neglect the social and communal dimensions of religion. His emphasis on will and effort can seem to underestimate the role of systemic forces and structural constraints on human action. Moreover, James's openness to unusual ideas, while admirable in many ways, sometimes led him to give credence to claims that have not held up well. His involvement with psychical research, for example, while understandable given his philosophical commitments, consumed considerable time and energy without yielding the definitive results he hoped for. His prose, while beautiful and accessible, can also be frustratingly vague or unsystematic. He circles around ideas rather than defining them precisely. He offers suggestions and possibilities rather than definitive conclusions. This open-ended, exploratory style is part of his charm, but it can also be frustrating for readers who want clear answers and systematic arguments. And yet, these limitations do not diminish the fundamental value of James' contributions. He opened up new ways of thinking about consciousness, about experience, about truth, about religion. He showed that it is possible to be scientifically rigorous without being reductionistic, to be philosophically profound without being obscure, to be spiritually open without being uncritical. He modeled an intellectual style that is humane, generous, and alive to the full richness of human experience. In the end, what James offers us is not a system, but a stance, a way of approaching the world with openness, curiosity, and courage. He teaches us to trust our experience, but also to question our interpretations, to be empirically grounded, but also open to mystery, to seek truth, but also to recognize that truth takes many forms and serves many purposes. He reminds us that consciousness is not a static entity, but a flowing process, that the self is not a fixed thing, but a dynamic activity, that reality is not a closed system, but an open, evolving, pluralistic universe in which novelty and creativity are real. He invites us to participate actively in the creation of meaning, to make choices that matter, to live with intention and purpose, even in the face of uncertainty. And perhaps most importantly, he reminds us that the life of the mind need not be cold, abstract, or detached from the rest of human experience. Thinking can be passionate, philosophy can be lived. The quest for understanding can be an adventure, a journey into the depths of consciousness and the mysteries of existence. As the night deepens and sleep approaches, let James's words accompany you into dreams. Let the stream of consciousness flow, unforced and natural. Let the images and thoughts drift by like leaves on water, noticed but not grasped, present but not permanent. Let the sense of self soften and dissolve, merging with the larger rhythms of rest and renewal. In the morning, you will wake to find the stream still flowing, consciousness renewed, ready to engage once more with the world. But now, in this liminal space between waking and sleeping, between effort and surrender, between thought and silence, simply rest. Rest in the knowledge that you are part of something larger than yourself, part of the endless flow of experience that constitutes the universe. Rest in the knowledge that your consciousness, your experience, your life matters, makes a difference, contributes something unique and irreplaceable to the unfolding of reality. Rest in the knowledge that truth is not something to be grasped once and for all, but something to be pursued with patience, humility, and openness. Rest in the knowledge that meaning is not something to be discovered in some distant realm, but something to be created here and now, in the midst of life, through attention, intention, and love. William James's life was a testament to the power of the human mind to overcome despair, to find meaning in uncertainty, to create beauty from struggle. His thought was a gift to humanity, a set of tools and insights that continue to illuminate the mysteries of consciousness and the possibilities of human existence. As you drift towards sleep, let his spirit accompany you, curious, open, kind, courageous. Let his vision of the pluralistic universe, with its infinite variety and possibility, open your mind to wonder. Let his trust and experience validate your own perceptions and feelings. Let his emphasis on will and choice empower you to shape your life with intention. The stream of consciousness flows on, in you and through you, connecting you to all of life, all of existence. It flows in the darkness as well as the light, in sleep as well as waking, in silence as well as speech. It is the medium of your experience, the substance of your selfhood, the thread that connects this moment to the next and the next and the next. And in this flowing, in this ceaseless movement of consciousness, there is a kind of peace, a recognition that everything changes, that nothing needs to be held or fixed, that we can trust the process, trust the stream, trust the universe to carry us forward into whatever comes next. William James spent his life exploring the stream, mapping its contours, celebrating its richness, honoring its mystery. He showed us that consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a wonder to be appreciated, not a machine to be disassembled, but a living process to be lived. So let the stream flow. Let consciousness do what it does, naturally and effortlessly. Let sleep come when it comes. Let dreams arise and dissolve. Let the night pass in its own time. There's nothing to achieve, nowhere to get to, nothing to prove. Just the gentle, continuous, ever-changing stream of experience, flowing on, moment by moment, into the mystery. And in that mystery, In that flowing, in that surrender to the process of consciousness itself, there is a kind of grace, a kind of coming home. For the stream of consciousness is not something alien or external. It is you. It is your life. It is the most intimate and undeniable fact of your existence. William James honored this fact, celebrated it, explored it with patience and care. He invites us to do the same, to pay attention to our experience, to trust it, to learn from it, to let it guide us toward truth, meaning, and fulfillment. As you rest now, as sleep takes you, carry this invitation with you. Carry James's curiosity, his openness, his courage, his trust in the flowing stream of consciousness. Let his words fade into the background. Let thinking give way to dreaming. Let the effort of attention give way to the effortless awareness of sleep. The stream flows on, has always been flowing, will always flow. In it, we live and move and have our being. To it, we can safely surrender, knowing that consciousness will renew itself, that we will wake again, that the adventure will continue. For now, though, only rest, only the gentle flow, only the quiet dark, only the deepening stillness as thought dissolves into silence and waking consciousness gives way to sleep. William James explored the stream. You are the stream. And the stream, in its endless flowing, carries us all toward shores we cannot see, through waters we cannot fully know, in a journey that is both utterly ordinary and utterly mysterious, both completely personal and part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. Rest in that paradox. Rest in that mystery. Rest in the stream. Good night, my friend. May your dreams be rich and your sleep be deep. May the stream of consciousness carry you gently through the night, and may you wake refreshed, renewed, ready to engage once more with the beautiful, terrible, endlessly fascinating adventure of being alive, being conscious, being human. The words fade now. The voice grows quiet. Only the stream remains, flowing, always flowing, in the soft darkness, in the sweet silence, in the gentle release of letting go. Sleep well.